Well, hello, all the followers of the Erudite Bibliophile with Wanderlust and readers who are here today for our special featured author discussion with Jasmin Iolani Hakes regarding her rich, impactful novel, HULA. Welcome, warmest regards, Jasmin.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And before we dive into our questions and discussion regarding hula, for perhaps the readers and viewers who are watching who might not have had a chance to read it yet, could you just give a quick, brief summary or blurb before we get started and everything?
Well, so basically, Hula is it's set in my hometown of Hilo on the Big Island of Hawaii. It's about a girl living on Hawaiian homelands who may or may not be actually Hawaiian on her birth certificate. And it kind of gives the historical and cultural context for why that matters. I'm so sorry. I can't figure out how to take that ding away. But yeah, so it goes into a lot of what people don't know about Hawaii, the
Yes.
kingdom and all of that. Yeah.
Well, and I read that you worked at the Hilo Public Library when you were a senior in high school in the mornings reshelving books. And so I thought, wow, what a full circle moment this must be for
Oh,
you.
when
Like seeing your book that you wrote about your hometown of Hilo and its history on now library shelves across the country. And then on top of that, gaining, recognition and being honored and validated by winning the Honolulu Book Awards Book of the Year about Hawaii as well. So
it was,
how does that all
you know,
feel? What was that
it,
like?
it was all very, I mean, when it got bought, all of those things were very surreal. But I think when I moved away, there was kind of this divide. So my life has kind of been a series of chapters that some of them don't seem to overlap much, and so all of it was just kind of surreal when the book was kind of coming out and everything like that. And a woman that I went to high school with actually works at the Gila Public Library now, and she posted a picture of when their copies came in.
Oh my goodness.
That was you nailed it. Like that was the moment where that felt so much more significant than anything that had come before that, because it hit that high schooler who didn't have a lot really kind of to dream of doing, or really hope for herself. And I only went to school in the mornings, and then the rest of the day I just surrounded myself in that safety of books and that world that I escaped through. And so yes, having it there, it was definitely incredibly surreal. Yeah.
She's like, I'm about to shelve your book.
Well, and my children, they're not children anymore, they're young women, but they tell me, because I used to tell people, like, I didn't have enough confidence to even dream of being an author or anything like that. It was basically about trying to survive, survive life. And they'd say, but mom, when we were little, we any time we went to a bookstore, past a bookstore, I would go into the bookstore and I'd put my hand where my book would, and I'd been doing it for so long that I wasn't like manifesting anything, or
Right.
I'd say in hindsight I was, but I guess
You
I
would
didn't
put your hand where like the
where
HAH.
my yeah. And I think I was dreaming of this for a lot longer than I even
Yeah.
acknowledged myself that I was, so
That's amazing too. Like you didn't even remember that you did that as well.
and they were just like, they called it. They were like, "Mom, come on." And I was like, "No, I really didn't." And they were like, "Why did you do that every single time?" So
Well, and I love the way you told the story of hula. Like you told it in such a beautifully layered story style where the readers are learning about the history and culture of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and how the land and its control was wrenched away from its people, as well as its cultures placed in like narrowly boxed into this stereotype, but all set and weaved against this backdrop of the four generations of women of the Naupaka family, Ulu, Hulali, Laka, and Ihi. And just if you could talk a little bit more about your process and decision on how to braid these two together in order to use one family's, history and life story to illustrate the history of a kingdom.
I had been trying for about a decade to write a book about Hawaii that was very safe. It wasn't any about anywhere in particular. It was just kind of set there, and I didn't really kind of realize how much I was trying to keep myself safe and writing about something that wouldn't kind of be my home, because the burden of representation, when there's not a lot of books about Hilo, putting one out about Hilo, it's going to get some eyes on it. And it's a very kind of place that doesn't have a lot of foot traffic. It's more foot traffic than ever before, but compared to Honolulu, compared to places with big hotels and everything, it's a fairly protective community. And so when I started writing it, I really wanted to kind of counter Missioner, which is what I grew up read. It was like the closest thing about Hawaii I could read, but it was so disconnected from anything that anybody I knew cared about, how our communities worked, what we thought about, what we were striving for, how we raised our kids, all of those, how we loved, how we spoke. And so when I was writing it, I really wanted to do a very simple but not easy story that was based on, I mean, from the only perspective that I could really give, which was I grew up in a very contentious time. Everybody was fighting for acknowledgement of America's involvement in the overthrow of the kingdom. And so there was a lot of protests. There was, for the first time, a lot of conversations about, um, who, quote unquote, belonged, Hawaiian homelands versus sovereignty lands versus private, developments. And I danced hula, and I had this middle name, Iolani, which is it was homage to a very revered hula dancer. But then I'd go to hula and I'd look in the mirror, and here's this white, blue-eyed girl. And I stood out so much, at least in my mind, that, I'd always felt my family, I'm the white black sheep, as they say,
Yeah.
and so I always kind of wondered, or was very self-conscious about what I looked like. And my grandfather would always tell us all these stories about, how he's Hawaiian and all these other things, but he grew up, when you're poor and a laborer and you grow up in an orphanage, records of your
Right.
family, it gets mixed up. And so I kind of grew up with this context of like, I don't know if I can claim being Hawaiian. In spite of that, I don't have
Right.
paperwork. And so if I'm not that, what am I? And so it became quickly a very scary story to tell, because I was kind of loosely basing the inspiration of the story off of that. But what came out through Hi'i's story was all the vulnerabilities, all the fear that I felt, all the confusion, and not a lot of, and I knew going into writing it that I wouldn't have a lot of answers. It's not an easy, reconciliation of who am I and where do I belong and who gets to say, those are all really big things. But so I wrote this story about this girl wanting to dance hula. And when I started kind of letting others into the story, I realized none of us knew enough about Hawaiian history, and the whys of why that mattered and what they were even fighting about. So I had to, in spite of me not wanting to do a missioner, I had to build out, the layers of the history and of the why. And the only way really, to me, that captured the very familial, almost loving claustrophobia in the best sense of the word, kind of community that Hilo is, this we voice came out, and in the we came all the the spunk and all the flavor, and being able to write it in pidgin. I don't know, it just freed me in this way that felt really liberating, but also very scary, very terrifying. Yeah.
Because I felt that you mirrored a lot of your own experiences in the feelings and experiences and journey with hula of Hihi.
Yeah.
Like it seemed like she was modeled. You could feel her being a little mirrored and modeled after what you said, how you felt in your experiences.
Yeah, although it was interesting, because I thought when I first started it, I was writing in pidgin really just kind of opened up some kind of floodgate in me. It was just coming out of me. But there was a part of me that felt like, oh, at a certain point, I'm gonna have to reconcile that I'm writing this autofiction, But she actually became so much of her own person. She actually started taking over in ways that had nothing to do with anything that I'd ever done. Although it's funny, my dad was reading it and he texted me and he was like, I didn't know you went through all of that. And I was like, Dad, it's fiction. Like I
Yeah,
didn't.
you're like,
You
there's
know?
some of it there, but
But
it's
what's
not all
true,
me.
like, so I tell people everything is true and none of it's true. The feelings are certainly true. And a lot of those stories in there were given to me. So they are true. Like the Hawaiianologist and the fight down in Puhi Bay and fighting the county. Those were all given to me. Those were family and community stories, so those are true. But as far as he went, yeah, it was interesting when she kind of took over and was like, no, it's not you.
Yeah.
This is my now,
Well, and then it's like you said, there's pieces of everyone in there. Well,
and that was cool.
I
you
really
know
love learning more about, hula and its significance as a means of visual storytelling in regards to depicting Hawaii's history and its mythology and its genealogy, and cultural traditions, and learning more about halau and kumu and the festivals like the Merry Monarch. And it kind of reminded me of another traditional Polynesian dance, of New Zealand, of the haka of the Maori, which is another breathtakingly, hauntedly beautiful dance that depicts, their culture and their ability to connect with their ancestors and their beliefs and celebrate and show pride. And it's almost as synonymous with their culture as hula is with the Hawaiian culture. And so I didn't know if you could. I know you danced hula since I think you said 4 years old. I read as a child and danced for a halau and as in a Tahitian troupe, as well as being a professional luau dancer in college. So I didn't know if you could speak more about how it feels when you're dancing hula and what hula means to you, and these how these traditional dances do kind of depict in a visual storytelling way so many things of carrying on traditions and history.
great question, thank you. Yeah, I think part of my thing was, in Hawaiian culture, your name is given to you usually in some kind of dream or something. It's been kind of given to you by maybe a higher power, to put it very simply. And so my name Iolani, after this hula, it came with this story, this context of like one of my ancestors had a dream, a great storyteller, great dancer, and I really internalized that. And when I danced, that was the only time I felt fully in my body and present, and I loved it. I mean, to this day, I can't watch hula without my body hurts. Like I want to cry. It's painful not to be dancing, and I haven't danced in a long time. But I think part of it was like as a teenager, starting to go through the who am I and the gawky, kind of growing pains of it all. I really got in my own way of like, well, I don't match this. Who am I kidding? And I grew up in a very traditional halau that at that time the priority was, or how we were taught was, you are learning things that are alive only because students before you learned it. And so you're not learning this, perform it. We practiced behind closed doors. Our parents couldn't, watch. We weren't, there was nothing performative about it. You were learning these chants, you were learning this choreography, you were learning these dances, because it's basically like oral history. Like think about all we know about Greeks and Rome, from epic poetry. And that was basically it. That hula told you everything about language. Hula told you how to be a steward of the earth. Hula told you why this volcano erupts and what you should do about this mist and how to take care of these fish and all of these things. And I really kind of felt so connected to that it was painful when I started feeling like I don't belong in Hawaii. I don't know where I belong, but I'm tired of feeling questioned if I belong here or not. And I don't have any answers and I just want to go at somewhere else. And so I kind of rebelled by dancing Tahitian and dancing at luau's, which meant I mean, it was like the worst possible
Right.
thing. Like, this means nothing. You're dancing for tourists, you're in a coconut bra. The dances are just kind of fluffy. And it was my way of still loving the physicality of dance without the pain, or at least what I hoped would be kind of a painless way to go about kind of circumnavigating all the politics, the cultural politics of it all. But when it came to writing the story, that to me, when you're talking about a kind of cultural tenacity, hula was it. Hula is to me and maybe that was my upbringing and my being taught at such an early age, that seed of like, this is the root of everything. We would not have Hawaii. We would not have a resurgence of language and mythology and all the stories and the history if not for hula, because everything was prohibited. Everything that was written through the filter of missionaries and Christianity, and was very interpreted. And so nothing would have survived, at least from how I was taught, from that kind of viewpoint. Nothing would have survived without hula. So to tell a story in this way, to me, what it became was, it's not a story about hula. It's a hula in the form of a book, and that's why you have kind of, it's told in a circular kind of way, and braided, you know.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
answers any of those questions.
No, you did. Um, and I um liked reading about, like, what you kind of mentioned this before. I liked reading about the effects and the magnitude and enactment of the blood quantum laws, that decided, who was Native Hawaiian, by how much, who got the land. And it had these resounding reverberations and echoes, of these same kind of laws on the Native American Osage tribal nation in Oklahoma, that was depicted in the book based award winning film, The Killers of the Flower Moon, where it talked about the same effects of these kind of laws on their head rights and their wealth management and their land. And so I didn't know if you could speak a little more about your research into the history of these blood quantum laws, these laws that were historically used by governments to strip the land and the rights from the indigenous peoples, and kind of decide and define how native someone was and how much of a race someone was. And also, if you had any updates or progress on, um, there's been like a push to decrease the minimum percentage amounts for successors and for attendees on the waiting list, to that original intent of Prince Kuhiho's 1/32 that he'd had to compromise on to 50% because of ranching and sugar industry in the state. I think I read that it was like introduced to Congress as the Hawaiian Homeland Preservation Act in like December of 2022, and then like re-pushed for a Hawaiian legislator to introduce it to Congress, and support it in like spring of 2023. So I didn't know if,
You did your research. I love it.
yeah, so I didn't know like if you had any I was trying to find like what were the updates on that, and because I know he originally, you know, thought of intermarriage and things like that, trying to protect like over time how that was going to be, and that's why he put the 1/32, but then ended up
Well,
having
and
percent.
it's an interesting thing, because people would kind of have started classifying my book as historical fiction, and I tell people it's actually current events, it's current
Yeah,
affairs,
it was
because
like a bit of both. Yeah.
yeah, because the conversation with blood quantum is a very current, pressing thing that we should all be paying a little more attention to, even the people that aren't, you know, um, directly impacted by it to a certain extent. But it's not just the Osage. Like, there are tribes throughout the continent that are dealing with this on a daily basis. You have podcasts of people saying, like, these are natives living on reservations, and they're concerned, like, if I fall in love with the wrong person
Yeah.
and have a child, that kid may or may not be able to live in our home. And so these are very big, huge things that people are being disqualified from tribes and being forced off of reservations, because of a culling of blood quantum. And the thing that always bothered me about blood quantum was how arbitrary and what a tool of genocide it was. The very first instance of blood quantum was a 2-sentence paragraph, basically, of the original colonies. I think it was Virginia, where it was basically first paragraph of, or first sentence was, if a native is not fully, full-blooded native, quote, whatever that means, then you can basically take their land. So it was meant to separate. And so for settlers, oh, they're not full natives, it's fair game, take it, as long as you have a flag, plant your flag on it. And then the second follow-up to that was, well, if anybody is any percent African, you're chattel. And so it was basically to protect your assets and to maximize your assets, and it benefited only one population, and it continues to benefit only one population. So that to me was, it's not science, it's not genealogy, that was just a political tool that continues to be used. And so in 1920, when they were writing the Homestead Act, that was where that language started to come from, to say, if you're more than 50%, and it was an incredibly cringy, racist write-up of a law, or of an act that said, basically, Hawaiians are in trouble. They're dying. They need to be reconnected to their land. Obviously, there's some symbiosis happening, and so when we started building cities and stuff, they started dying off, or continued to die off in rapid numbers. So we need to get them back to their land. But the people that have enough white blood, they should be okay. They got white in them, so they'll figure it out. It's the more than 50% ones that need, quote unquote, help. And so that became the threshold for homeland awards. And it kind of, we so internalized that language. Like, when we talk about what we are, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with it, but it to me shows how much, as an American nation, we have internalized this idea of quantum. So if you introduce, you'll say, oh, I'm half this and I'm a quarter this, and it seems very kind of innocent and kind of innocuous to speak in that language. But for cultures like this, your life is at stake. One of my very, very good friends since high school, she inherited her father's homeland award. Her son inherited her mother's place in line for her homeland award. They have to, in order to keep that land, you have to build, there's certain things you have to do. I mean, because you're not given the land, you're leased the land, your big award. So you have to build, you have to do all of these things to keep it. She put in all of the energy and time and resources and money and all of these things into meeting that and making sure that they had that land secure. She just had her first grandchild. That grandchild does not have enough Hawaiian blood to inherit that. And so she and I were just talking, a few weeks ago, and when she's like, I feel like I should have just bought a house a long time ago. What was I doing? Now my grandson has nothing. I can't. And so I think there's still going to be need to be a bigger push for those thresholds to lower. But I think in Hawaii, what has started to kind of, the wheels have started to turn, of getting more Hawaiians in, and more locals who understand the gravity of this, into elected office and into positions where they can really be powerful enough to change that. And so I think it's going to take a little more time. It's not going to be as easy as we'd hope it would be, because to some people it's not as cut and dry as, oh, let's just lower the limits. Although it's interesting, because every tribe, apparently, well, from my understanding, every tribe in the United States has their own, most tribes at least, I think, have their own ability to decide how they're gonna kind of incorporate blood quantum, and if they're going to, for eligibility requirements. I was having a conversation with Morgan Telty, who wrote Fire Exit, and I don't know if you read that, but I mean, it's another novel about blood quantum. So I was like, oh my God, somebody
Called
else.
Fire Exit.
it's called Fire Exit, and it's really kind of a total 180 from my take on blood quantum, because for him and his history of his tribe, at least from our conversation, what I understood was he said at a certain point, because you fraction, so it inevitably every generation at a certain point the numbers become so minute, and he goes, no, we just reset. And I was like, what does that even mean? And even they're treating it in their tribe anyway as like this, it's a concept, that they're using, but you can reset it, and nobody's walking around going, I'm 1/380th,
Right.
percent something. And Maoris, you brought up Maoris did that too. They had a great cultural resurgence after they fought politically to redefine themselves, and what politically made somebody Maori. And what the language that they changed was they took blood quantum out of it. And so there are all these papers coming out of New Zealand that are saying, you know, that was the best thing that we could ever done, because nobody is saying, oh, I'm only a little bit. They're not disqualifying themselves. I'm only a small kind, so I'm not going to participate. They're just like, you're either Maori or you're not.
Yeah.
But for Fire Exit, the premise for that novel was basically a guy was raised native. I think his mom married a native man who was his stepfather, but he was raised with him. So he was raised on this reservation. But as soon as he came of age and the stepdad died, he had to leave the reservation. But by then he had a daughter, and he didn't want to leave. But he also, the the woman, that the daughter's mother, didn't want to raise the daughter with him being the acknowledged father, because that would have meant that the daughter wouldn't have been enough native to stay on the
Oh,
reservation. So he lives across the street from the reservation, so he can just watch his daughter from afar and never tell her that, so it's all, so it was another good example of how much this seemingly innocent thing that we talk about, like, oh, I'm a quarter this and I'm a half this, can really impact people, and do really impact people's lives. My grandfather always said that. He said, at a certain point, the family, we just had small kind. He said, oh, it's just small kind. And when you were, back in those days, you could put three different things on your birth certificates. And so they would emphasize the whiteness, because that would give them the labor jobs and stuff. Oh, we're Portuguese, we're these things. And he, to the day he died, lamented the fact that, like, he had not been able to figure out a way, or like was waiting for a grandchild who could put it back on our birth certificates. And it was kind of a sad thing, because growing up, I'd just hear him, and it was always just this, like, not necessarily disappointment in us, but we were definitely lacking. We were the grandkids that didn't have it on our birth certificates, and it was really a source of pain for him, and very confusing for us, because I was like, oh, well, obviously I know enough, I can't claim this thing, but then what does that mean? I know what I'm not, but I don't know what I am,
right.
So I'm hoping that they lower those amounts, but I think in order for that to happen, more people are going to have to um uh disassociate with that kind of mindset, and understand the history of where that came from, and that it's basically a tool of colonization,
Yeah,
not
for
a
sure.
not a defining, not a way that is based on anything except our concepts of what makes a person, and what they can claim as their own.
And you had talked to a little bit ago about the use of pigeon when you're writing your novel, um, about using it kind of in the dialogue. And I read a quote that you said that it was very important to you to write hula in the language of your birth. And so I had read that, pigeon is still very much used today, and that the Hawaiian native language of Olelo, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Olelo, it has also had kind of a resurgence of, being, taught in schools and being used more and spoken more. Um, and, these kind of native indigenous languages are having this kind of resurgence of, being recognized as a distinct part of a nation's heritage and culture, and that they should be, preserved and supported and not stigmatized and censored. And it kind of reminded me of, um, I'm learning Doric Scots, which is of my family in Northeast Scotland, and it kind of had a similar trajectory of Alelo, where it was looked down upon, and it was kind of banned to be used outside of the home and at schools. And so now, where it's, finally Scots is recognized as an official language by the UK and Scottish and EU governments. And there's been a resurgence in, learning it and putting it back into the schools, and things like that. And I know it said that Olelo was finally recognized as one of the state languages of Hawaii in 1978, after it had been banned after the annexation of the state. And so I didn't know if you could speak a little bit more about, currently what is the, situation as far as the use and progress of the perception of those languages, and your experiences with the pidgin and the lelo, and the importance of you writing those into your book.
Yeah, I mean, well, think about it. So you said 1978, that's almost 100 years of it being prohibited. And so think about what happens in 100 years of something being prohibited. I mean, at a certain point, at a certain time, the Hawaiian Kingdom was the most literate country in the world, and we had Hawaiian newspapers, we had all of these things. And then the Hawaiian language was seen as something that was um, keeping people down. And so all the schools started only teaching in English and only reading in English. Slowly, all the Hawaiian newspapers kind of capitulated to the English, written newspapers. So by the time I was growing up, and I didn't, to be fair to my memories, I didn't realize I mean, when you're a kid, and now I feel old when I say, like, back in the 80s.
Yeah.
um, but I didn't it was just these things, these big things were happening, and I had no idea they were happening right in our town, and that the history was being made. Like, oh, those are those aunties, and they're working on the Hawaiian language, and I'm like, oh, okay, whatever that means,
Right.
and because nobody spoke Hawaiian. I knew one person who spoke Hawaiian, and we'd all go quiet, because when he'd have to call his mom to be like, can I stay longer, because we'd all kind of move as as a big fog of
Right.
kids, we'd all get quiet because his mom wouldn't answer unless he's only spoken Hawaiian. And so he'd be like, Mom, can I go? But he would, and all of us would be quiet. And I didn't even really kind of realize it was because we never heard Hawaiian. We never
This is
heard
your only time to hearing it.
it. There were no books. There was no olalo. Nobody spoke it. I mean, people did, but not in a way that it was ever kind of in any classrooms or in any books that we could see. It wasn't formalized. And I do credit HULA a lot to the preservation of that, of that language. But what was interesting was when they were creating the curriculum, that is true. I only about 50 people, and I'm sure there were more people than that, but that they could find when they did this study, 50 people spoke Olelo. Like 50 people. That's it. Kept the entire language alive. And it was prohibited for so long that there were no words. Like, language, it constantly evolves.
Right.
We did
There weren't
there
modern words for it even.
I mean, TV and car and radio and all of these things. So you had to kind of fast forward, speed track a language to be
And
able
were
to.
those 50 people responsible for coming up with the words for the
Not
new?
necessarily, but I don't know how exactly it worked, but I remember that happening in my periphery, and then reading much later when I was doing research for HULA to just fact check, kind of compare something with my memories of, like, oh, Hilo actually was one of the very first charter schools that taught exclusively in Olalo. And now I go home and the kids are speaking to each other more in Olelo than they are in English,
Oh,
which is
wow.
phenomenal. And so my kids feel a little like, Mom, like, we're
Yeah.
missing, like,
You're like,
there's,
I didn't know it either.
yeah, and when I remember flying back once, and there was two flight attendants sitting in the back speaking to each other, not for show, not for anything, but they were speaking in Olelo. They were speaking Hawaiian, and I was just like, that is amazing to me. In a single generation, in my generation, I went from not hearing it at all to overhearing the flight attendants, just kind of whispering to each other in Olelo. And I mean, it floors me. But I think that also kind of made me really want to capture a specific time, because yeah, people still speak pidgin to a certain extent in Hilo and throughout Hawaii, but it's very different than what it was when I was when my eldest was reading it. She was like, "Mom, nobody talks like that." And I was like, they don't now, but the
Right.
sayings and like there are specific things, like nobody in Hilo would ever tell you to turn off a light. They'd say close the lights. You know,
Right.
and so for me, and I had to fight a few of my editors, my poor line editors, to say like, this costs you nothing to leave it in as it is, and most mainstream readers won't get it, but they don't have to. But the people that it's for will latch onto this and know that this is for them. It's all these Easter eggs of,
Right.
nobody will get this, and I'm not going to explain it to you because it ultimately doesn't matter to the story, but to the people that it means something to, it means a lot
Right.
to.
Like you're being
Because
true to that language.
yeah, well, and we don't see that captured in literary form. And also there was so much shame for generations. If you were a local kid or Hawaiian kid going into school, you were shamed. You're brown, so you have to, oh, you speak like a, uneducated, whatever. You have to correct it. You're basically wrong, and you have to correct it. And so like you'd be studying English or something, you'd bring your English homework back home, and your parents couldn't help you because they're like, I don't know what that is,
Yeah.
whatever. And they have this heavy pigeon, and so there was this shame attached to it. And I wanted to, and that was kind of why there were some conversations between Hulali and Laka, that I wanted to have in pigeon, to show like these are very intelligent people. This is a language. This does not speak to their thought, their abilities to think, and their abilities to communicate. And I see that continually changing, but I wanted to, I guess, kind of capture and celebrate that, and the rhythm that I grew up hearing, that I still so attach to my home. To me, it was like a reclaiming of it.
Yeah, because like you said, in the past they had such a rich literary history, and and then to now it be vanished to then now come back, because it was the same with
Yeah, I
folklore.
mean, and so the opposite for me was true when I was a kid. When I would call my mom to ask like whatever, or tell her where was, if I spoke in pigeon, she'd just hang up. Like,
Right.
because to her it was like that was limiting. If you were a kid that spoke pigeon and didn't know how to tighten that up, you were going to be dismissed at school, or you weren't going to be taken seriously at job interviews or something like that. And so there was a real, like, I get scoldings at home. And now my mom will text me, and she's just like allowing herself to be that, and speaking heavier pigeon than I've ever heard her speak. And I love it, because it's just kind of like this, like, it's owning it, of like, no,
Right.
we're not gonna, the rubric for success when I was growing up was leaving
Yeah.
and being basically as white as possible. And that's not the case anymore. These kids aren't dreaming of leaving. They're dreaming of, how can I contribute to this society? How can I contribute to this? And I guess, to me, this book was my attempt, or my desire to do the same thing, to contribute in some way, to this continued resurgence, this stoking of this fire that
Right.
hopefully will never ever go out.
Yeah, because the same with the Doric Scots I was telling you about. It was like that, where you weren't supposed to speak it outside the home because it was looked down upon, because it was like, not as formal as English. And and they finally did a census kind of right before the official language, where trying to find out how many people actually spoke Scots. And of course there were many dialects out there, but it was like millions of people.
Oh.
So
But it had never been written down or anything.
No, they like it just like the history kind of Ola, I can't say it right, Olalu, where
Ola, yeah.
had a rich history, Robbie Burns, all of that, and it was spoken, in the home and in the communities, but like you weren't supposed to learn it at school, and it was not, you're supposed to use your formal English and whatnot. And now
Yeah.
everybody still spoke it at home and in the communities and knew it, and they find out millions of people still speak these dialects. And so yeah, so it's official language, and like you said, now there's more books being published in Doric again, and people learning it, and it
You
being
can
taught.
actually access things to learn it.
Yeah, and like the government like putting forth bills to like encourage learning of it in schools, and supporting it, and that kind of thing. So it kind of seemed like they had similar trajectories, and I'm sure in multiple probably other native indigenous languages are going through the kind of the same resurgence, because they realize that's integral to the nation's history and culture.
I mean, it was just bonkers. You couldn't write a check in Hawaiian. You're in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And to some people, it's still a kingdom. If you're basing, kind of your political opinions on international law, in many eyes, Hawaii is still a kingdom. It's just, under duress. It's being occupied.
Yeah.
And so to be able to not even write kind of a check or defend yourself in court using the
Right.
language of your kingdom, it's bonkers when you look at it that way. But honestly, people still, I think when I was in high school, American history, we had one day, and I didn't even cover a full day lesson of Hawaiian history. And it was basically the only thing that was taught was the year Hawaii became a state. And I know in Hawaii that has changed immensely, but for a lot of places throughout the country, that's not the case. They don't know anything about Hawaii. I've heard from a few classes of like high school classes, students that their teachers turned it into a curriculum, and they wrote me and they're like, I didn't even know it was a kingdom. My
Yeah.
family goes there every summer.
Right.
Well, my parents is they thought I was lying. So there's still a lot of people that have no clue. And my argument for them is like, you're missing out. You might love Hawaii, but if you don't know where you are,
Yeah.
you're not even seeing half of it. Half of what truly is beautiful about this place. And the reason people go here, it's not just the beaches.
Right.
Because then I would argue, then you'd see as much, beloved traffic in other places with great beaches.
Yeah.
There are plenty of places with great beaches that aren't Hawaii, and I think there's a reason people are drawn to it and they don't even know why they're drawn to it. There's an energy there, there's a culture, and it's because it's a specific place. It's not just a playground, it's not just a golf course.
Yeah, I read there's a quote that you said that um that Hulu, it's like a peek behind the postcard, if you will. And I thought that was described it perfectly, because I thought, you know, readers are going to come away from reading Hula with, looking at Hawaii with a different set of eyes, a new set of eyes, and have such a deeper appreciation and understanding of, Hawaiian history and culture and its people. And, armed with this awareness and knowledge that, like you said, either they've never learned before in school, or if they did learn it in school, if it was even taught, it's been forgotten.
Mhm.
And so I thought that kind of described that perfectly. And you also said, I think in the same article, that novels have an ability to transport someone to a place and deepen their understanding of that place. And it's hard to replicate that, but it's
Yeah.
hard to
Well,
replicate
and, I
that.
knew, like, growing up, or when I moved here and started kind of really having a community of people that weren't as familiar with Hawaii as I am, or from there, they would always ask me, like, where can I go? What can I do? And everything. And so I have my, cut and paste here, go to here, eat here, don't go to that,
Right.
you know. But I realized no matter how much I tell you, you will never have access to my Hawaii. You will never be able to go into my Hawaii and be in that space. And so that was my pushback for the pigeon being what it was, and for not explaining all of these things, because my thought was, when I go travel somewhere and I'm on a tour, it's cute. I got some great pictures for my Instagram feed, and everything like that. If I go somewhere and the trip goes off script,
Yeah.
I get invited to somewhere. I get invited into the home of some, a family or something, and I'm sitting there and they're speaking a language that I don't know. I don't know what I'm eating. I kind of feel out of place. I will never forget that experience, even though I only understood 70% of it. And so that was my argument was you might feel uncomfortable and not even know what I'm talking about, but I want you to feel that way because for the mainstream reader, you never do. You walk into every room and you listen to people talk or you listen to stories, understanding all the cultural context, all what I'm alluding to, all the coded language. And so you're always in a place where you're at the center of the room, and actually me putting you in the corner adds value to your experience, and but my poor marketing people, yeah, I would say this is the look behind the postcard, and then
Right.
I'm like, and now sell it. And they were like, how do we even promote this? Like, I was like, let's just do a postcard and it's just the back of it. I mean, it was like, how do you commodify and sell a book about the criticism of a commodification of a culture? I don't, my poor team.
But like you said, I mean, like in the article, you said just like what you just said, that books are almost like an author's invitation into your home, and that they leave an imprint on you, and they create a familiarity and create memories, and like you said, it's like it creates an authenticity that is
And
unmatched.
yeah, when we were sending it out for reviews and early kind of feedback and things, that's consistently people were like, I'm so glad I read this before I went, or I wish I had read this before I went, or I picked this up here and it changed everything about my visit. And that to me was meant everything. I was like, what more can a book do than open your eyes? That's why I always loved books. And as a poor kid on an island who can't drive anywhere, that was my window into the world. And that was, no matter how poor I was and how lacking of resources, that gave me the library in my head gave me the ability to go into rooms and have conversations with intimidating people and to dream of other things specifically because of that. And I felt very much like Hawaii at that time. Now Hawaii, there's an amazing array and continues to grow this collection of books out of the state and out of the kingdom, and his like nonfiction and fiction. But at that time there wasn't really anything there when Kiana Davenport started writing when her books came out. It was like the first time I had ever heard of any local family being centered in a book, based in Hawaii. That had never The Shark Dialogues to me was revolutionary because I was just like, oh, people actually will read this not from and not be from Hawaii. It was to me this mark of like, oh, we do have something to offer the world of value. We don't have to turn ourselves into something else. Like, I mean, think about just as a kid, all of your textbooks are written to kids living on the continent. All of your tests, like word problems, they would talk about things that we never experienced in our lives,
Right.
growing up on an island. So nothing formal, nothing in our curriculum, nothing on TV ever reflected anything about our reality, you know? So yeah, it was, I think across the board, not just in Hawaii, I think we're the conversation around literature in general is really expanding into that acknowledgement
And
of
well,
like,
I like how you said that in that same article, how you said, read books not just as an escape, like at a vacation, read them to make these trips more meaningful and enriching, and to take something more away. And like you said, to appreciate the authenticity and the create empathy and all of those things.
it turns destinations into places,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
Well, and I didn't know, did you, doing so much research, did you learn things that you had not learned before, or did it change your viewpoints of?
So much. Like I said, I didn't know the history, you
Oh,
know,
like that was stuff you didn't know.
nothing. I knew memories. I knew of the protests at at the Walmart because I was there. I knew all these things because I was there, but I didn't really understand the gravity of everything. I didn't, and there weren't a lot of history books. Hawaiian history now, you can look, there's a whole section of books. I have them, I've tracked them all down, and I cherish them because they didn't exist before. You still have books in like the Stanford Library that talk about Hawaiian culture from like, oh, they practiced, infant, like they would eat their babies. I mean, horrible racist things. And that was all you could read about Hawaiian history. And so, oh my God, the research, to me, everything started clicking. And I would just, some days I would cry, and I'd call my mom and I'd just be like, Mom, did you know like this? And she was,
Yeah.
and she didn't either, I
No,
mean,
you
and
find her too.
yeah, and then there was a period of, I had to really kind of fact check my hula. I was very adamant. I I didn't know how to write about something that I hold so sacred that I wouldn't write about it, which is very, very paradoxical. But it was like, I want to write a book that's a hula, but I'm not going to give you any choreography. I'm not going to tell you how to dance it because that is deeply, deeply disrespectful and goes against everything I've ever been taught. But I do need to kind of create some kind of protocol so you understand what this looks like, and it was I had to reconnect with my kumu and go through a series of lessons that she had put on through COVID. That was like an international, a roomless halal, if you will, a virtual halal. And she would go through all these things that were based in what she calls Hawaiian life ways, but was all the things I had learned in hula. But as a kid, like, your kumu says, do this, they're not going to tell you why. You just do it. You
Right.
know, to me, it was like also learning like, oh, that's why we did that
That's
thing.
that meant. And
That's what
yeah.
that symbolizes. Oh, I mean, all of these things were happening. And then tracking down, like, there were certain scholars who spoke to me about, all their research and all of their work on blood quantum laws and putting all of that into books. And Kehaulani Kaunui was very, very helpful. But then also like tracking down other people, like the woman who was a staffer, a young staffer who was tasked as like her job assignment to actually write the bill,
Oh,
and she's just like, how do I even come up
right.
with the language for this thing? And so her being on the phone with me, telling me, and then I wrote this whereas because so and so said I should do this, and like, having this combination of community stories, inherited stories, and then first kind of primary sources. Oh my gosh, I my understanding of my home is so much greater, and my appreciation for it is so much greater now than I mean, I never would have probably undertaken this if I had known how
Right.
much.
What you're about to step
But I
into.
never would have. I mean, now you see through a different lens, and I certainly do. It's amazing.
It's like trying to put aside your fear of getting it wrong because then it would never be out there. Like
Yeah.
you, and
At a
now,
certain point, I just had to kind of like, hence all my author's notes. you know, it was just like, if whatever's wrong, I tried my best, and I'm sorry. That's my on me. If something's wrong, like
so this is
somebody
a off point for the
at
next.
a certain point, I just kind of had to say like, I have to let this go. And the one thing I didn't want was to offend anybody in Hilo. And if I did, then at least they're not telling me they're not saying it to my face that they are, but to a certain extent, like there was one thing, I think Mary Monarch tickets were like a quarter. Somebody corrected me on something like that, and I was like,
Right.
okay, like, I'm sorry, but yeah, it's not, as my mom, she kept like, it's fiction, and I wanted it to represent, but I also kind of had to, for myself, just say, I could spend the rest of my life
Right.
was that stop sign there? Was that shade of green? And I did have to let it go.
Because overall it didn't affect the whole story, but yeah.
Yeah. Like there were certain things where I'm like, that happened in 77, but it would be so much better if it happened in 78, and I tried to stay true to 99% of it and not turn it into something malleable, but like the evolution of all the political acts and how that came to be, that didn't need fictionalizing at all. I mean, it was
Right.
like these things were so integral to what Hawaii is today that I couldn't not include them. And thankfully, my editors kind of agreed. They were just kind of like, take up as much space as you need to. We'll worry about word count later, and just write it. And that was very freeing and incredible to have that kind of value. Although it's interesting because HarperCollins is international imprint, so I think they really did treat it like an international title, which I think it needed to be.
Yeah. Well, and I think, you needed to know all the beginning and the origins to understand, like, when you're then talking towards the end of the book about, Bill Clinton issue an apology, like, to understand the magnitude of that and what that meant, and you know what I mean? Like, you had
Oh,
to
and
know.
even early on, like there's a fight between Laka and Hulali about the land, and is she going to come and claim it? And like my agent and stuff, they're like, I don't get it. Like, I don't see the problem here. Why does it matter if she has Hawaiian on her birth certificate? And so, yeah, all of those things, they aren't just political. They are the social context for everything in Hawaii. When you're in elementary school, and this was the case then, and I'm sure it's the case now, like the first day you get a form to fill out, and basically it's, are you Hawaiian or are you not?
Right.
And there's two boxes. There's no
Right.
like, it's complicated. How much time do you have?
Right. Well, yes, but
Yeah,
but yeah,
exactly.
you're being told, you're being, already being, as a child, thinking that way. You're already being started in that mindset of, I am or I'm not, or
And
how
it's
much
so
am I
hard
paying?
because it's like it is complex. And I think when you had the fires in Maui, a lot of conversations kind of touched on this, where you had a lot of people that have come from the Philippines and come from Japan, come from other places that have been there a long, long
Like,
time.
as plantation workers,
if
and
you
yeah.
were if you were still a kingdom, you would be a Hawaiian citizen. You would be a Hawaiian national. And
Right.
same
And
if
there's like the 1800s, like.
yeah. And so I think that's hard in the context of like, if you're from the continent and you kind of think of tribes being this homogenous society community within a homogenous like geographic group. Hawaii is complicated. Not that all of those people are claiming to be Hawaiian, but they don't like, they're not attached to anywhere else, you
They're
know?
in between. I'm not from there, but I'm not from there.
Like I've never been to Puerto Rico. I've never been to the Philippines, How do I claim that? My family, my Filipino side, early like 1819, 1820, early, and and so like in Maui, you had actually Hawaiian people that were defending. They were like, hey, don't be bashing this guy, he's been my neighbor for 200 years,
Right.
even though he's Filipino. And so I think the occupation and the coup and the overthrow of the kingdom complicated a lot more than just the monarchy and just the politics of it. It really permeated every level of society.
Well, and I read somewhere where you said, when you moved to California, you were trying to carve out, your identity in your home, but the longer you were away from Hawaii, the clearer your connection to Hawaii became. And when I read that, it clear as day, the Welsh word "irith" came to me. I don't know if you've heard of that word.
Say it again.
Um,
Iris.
I don't know if I'm saying it right, but it's the Welsh word, and it's Hiraeth, Hiraeth.
Oh, okay.
And it's a Welsh word, so it doesn't translate exactly to English, but usually the rough translation of it is it's like a deep longing or a homesickness or nostalgia for a place that's absent or lost. Some say it's like a deep yearning or a pulling of the heart for a homeland, for a people, for a time and its culture and its traditions. And assert that it can be a source of sadness and grief, especially for immigrants or for suppressed peoples. But then it also can be a source, a key to a revival of, culture, to be able to connect and revive that culture again by learning the languages, by festivals, by storytelling, by updating, the school curriculum. And it kind of led me to think like how much your higher might have led to the
Oh,
impact and
yeah.
formation of this book, and of how hula can be a revival in of the Hawaiian history and the culture, and how it can be like a tangible source of comfort for
Yeah.
all those who are having that same kind of high for the Hawaii that you've written in its pages.
Yeah, I kind of naively thought, I'm just going to go to the land of the white people and I'll fit right in because I'm white. And I realized when I got here that I wasn't as white as I thought I was. You know what I mean? If that was, for me, I was so white because my family's all so dark. Even my mom was like, what is this thing? The joke of the family was if I hadn't been born at home, she's like, no way, you would have been left at the hospital. You're not my kid.
Yeah.
And so moving to California, I was just like, I'm just going to do it this way. And I'm never going to have my kids feel like outsiders. So I'm not going to talk to them about Hawaii at all. And we're just going to fit right in. And we didn't. And we continued not to. And the farther away I got from Hawaii, I think, I didn't realize that was the root of the empty that I felt. And in Hawaii, you have what's called like your na'au. Your na'au is like your deep in your like womb, the knowledge that comes from there. It's like that's your brain, your center, it's your intuition. But it's also just kind of like your gut, maybe would be the right word for it. And
Connect to the
yeah,
land.
well, I just felt like that was like there was a tug on my na'au, like this deep, existential, like when I got invited to Hedgebrook, which is this writing residency in on an island, Whidbey Island in Washington State, and very remote. And as a single mom, it was my first time of just being able to just sit. And they're like, "You just do you," and I'm like, "I don't even know what that means." And just crying and realizing like this is what I have to write, and almost not wanting to because knowing it would be painful and I'd have to excavate a whole bunch of things. But that was that na'au pool. That was home. And really it started. The one really autobiographical thing in hula is the multicultural festival for her youngest. My youngest was in elementary school and they were having a multicultural festival. And the first year she was like, no way, mom, we're not participating. And the year afterwards, I was like, I'm not asking you, we're doing this. And I realized we didn't even have a pareo in the house. Like I had never taught them hula. All they had heard about Hawaii was my angst. They had inherited kind of my distance to it. They still went back. I mean, all their
Right.
families there, but they didn't hear anything of my love for it. And or the source of the distance had nothing to do with ambivalence. It was pain, pain for feeling disconnected from it. And that's on me, And so my eldest picked up her ukulele and taught herself something really simple, and I danced with my youngest, and she was following me on stage, and there were all these kids, and we did the hukilau, which is so silly, and it's in English, but it was what my eldest could perform very easily, and what I could, after years of not dancing, what I could show Mila, my youngest, in the week that we were practicing. And we made halpia squares and we passed out lays, and the whole school was clapping for Mila and yay Mila after our dance. And I stood on stage with my girls, and this is like, I've talked about this before and I've never cried. um it was such a moment of, that was my reckoning of like, I have starved my kids of this, and that's on me. And I did the exact thing that we were taught never, never to do, which was let it die. I almost did that. Because if I didn't pass those family stories, if I didn't pass that down to my kids, they didn't have it. And that's how things die. That's how, if you don't listen to your elders and write these things down and value what's being spoken in home, right? In Scotland, it just goes away. It dies. And so I think that was what I thought, no matter how scary this gets, and no matter if I get something wrong, I can't not do anything about that. Or I can at least try to make something not die, you know? So that was, yeah, that festival. I mean, I don't think anybody knew that like a school, Thursday evening was going to change the course of my life, but it was something about dancing hula with them. And I tried to give that to Hi'i, of the pain of that, when she's, there's a scene where I mean, she's also grieving her husband, but she's feeling the complicated pain of trying to remember how to dance and let hula back into her body. And I tried to kind of um, really communicate how connected a just physical body. Yes, it's spiritual, and there's all these layers to hula, but also the physical energy of it. You are something not yourself when you dance with the halal. You embody the water. You embody what the whole group is trying to create. And it can be painful. The re-entry, it can be painful, but necessary.
Like you said, I mean, you'll have generations who have been gone from a place, but they still feel that pull and that hierarchy, like for that culture, and that heritage that is inside them, even if their generations past and haven't lived there, but that it's this pull that you
That was,
feel
yeah,
the land.
yeah,
Like I hear bagpipes, I hear like it's the same
yeah.
pull for me, like as far as that kind of stuff
I can
goes.
imagine. I mean, and I think there is a resurgence of, like, my mom actually 2 weeks ago, she's like, we're in Scotland. We're in Scotland, and that's a specific, there's this like a long coming acknowledgement internationally of like, this is a specific different place than anywhere that surrounds it. And I think I wrote something so specific to me that I didn't even really process that it might be something a little more universal. Like, one of my first book events, I went up to Northern California to a library, and I think it was like my second event. So I hadn't really gotten used to or gotten a feel for the reception of it. People were still not reading it yet, it was still kind of making its way out into the world. And it was a full house. They sold out the books. There were two elderly women fighting over the last one, and they were looking at me. They're like, "This isn't really aloha, but give it to me," And but when the woman I was in conversation with opened up the floor to questions, this young woman's hand in the back shot up, and she paused, and she started crying, and she said, "I don't really have a question. I just came to thank you, because I don't tell anybody I'm Hawaiian. I look the way I do, and I was born here. And so I always think, how do I even claim that for
Right.
myself? Like she had disqualified herself. And so I think for people, and I've heard this way outside of Hawaiian culture too, is like, we disqualify ourselves from so much, and that was when she started crying, and she goes, "I just want to thank you, for articulating that to me, like putting language into this feeling that I've had all my life." Whew, that was a lot. But I guess it speaks to that literary concept of, you boil something down, you peel back all the layers, and you boil something down to something so specific, it does become universal. You might not know anything about Hawaii or care really about the politics of it and the apology bill, and you don't have to. You read this book, it's about belonging. It's about wanting to know my place in the world and where my roots are, and not feeling like I have it. And I think a lot of I didn't realize how American this book was until like our foreign rights people and stuff like that. They started going, yeah, no, this book is so about America, that feeling, because we move so much more than I think a lot of cultures do and stuff, that we do have that
And our
weird,
diaspora, a mix of so many.
you
Yeah.
know, and so we have these different cultural things, but then we're twice removed from it, and it's, and then it might, these traditions, you know, your kids don't understand why we do these things and they push, there's all these layers to it that I guess I didn't realize until meeting readers and seeing how it was being read. You know, it's a weird thing, writing something and then having to let it go, you
The
know.
vast world.
Yeah, because you don't have, I mean, go to any book club, right? You can all read the same book and
Right.
everybody, it's like, are we reading the same book? You know?
But yeah, it's reflecting the beauty in our diversity, and but just as in the beauty in our diversity, but also our commonalities as humans and connections and whatnot.
Yeah.
Well, and I know that Hula has been such a labor of love for you for so many years. Um, Now that, I mean, you're still obviously talking about Hula, still doing book clubs, still talking to people like me, but what might be the next step in your literary journey? Or is there another book on the horizon? You know, like, I don't want to leave without saying, okay,
Right.
what now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so like well, like many writers, this is the book, the first book I published, but not the first one I wrote, right?
Right.
I wrote actually, before this, before I even acknowledged my attempt to be a writer, I had been writing a memoir to try to tackle some things that I think, when I realized, when I can quantify, when I can put something into a sentence, I can basically contain it and process it. And there were a lot of things that had happened in my life that I hadn't been able to process, and a lot of it had to do with my kind of complicated relationship with Hawaii, and the ways that I left it, and all that I had to do to find my way back to it. And so we've been working on that memoir for long before Hula was
Oh,
ever
wow.
concept. But now, of course, my agent and my editors are like, well, we the memoir's done, but they're like, we want another novel first. The very first novel I tried to write, but it was a very complicated plot, or it required a lot of scaffolding that I didn't have the ability to do. I had been working on it for about 10 years. And so I just recently completely rewrote it. It has the same title and the same concept, but it's nothing like what I was writing before.
Oh,
That's be shelved and never see the light of day. But basically, I'm hoping it comes out later next year. My editor has it right now. We're working on edits, but it's there were 10 Hawaiians that went with a man named John Sutter to Northern California before it was anything, when it was very inhospitable. And he got a land grant, a very large land grant, because these 10 Hawaiians kind of helped him settle the area and served as his ambassador to kind of some hostile locals, and were integral to his survival, and were there at the beginning of the gold rush. And and no one knows their names, except they're known as Sutter's Hawaiians, and they've been fascinating me since I moved to California. You know, yeah, you know, and they would just go like, "Oh, Sutter's Hawaiians," and I'm like, "Well, who are these people, and why are they so important to history, but nobody knows they exist?"
know them before you moved to California, or not until you got?
I no, I didn't know about them at all. When I moved to California, I moved to Sacramento to get into to government, and I was there. My daughter was 3, and I was homeschooling her because I was like, I don't know anything about like white people. Like this, it was very intimidating. And so we joined this homeschool group, and we'd go to like historical things. And so one of the very first things we did was went to Sutter's Fort, and they gave you a tour. And the first door you go into at Sutter's Fort for the tour is basically a room where they have large printouts of pages of his diaries. And all he did throughout those diaries was give credit to his Hawaiians. And I was like, who are these Hawaiians? And the
Right.
guy was like, I don't know, but you should write a book about them because I give this tour every day and that's all I can say about them.
Oh
So
my gosh.
I've been trying to research all these years, not knowing really what I was
Right.
doing, and
You're
finally
gonna
getting the
have to
kind
write
of,
the book about the 10 that he can
yeah.
say.
So I finally did it. It was a big undertaking because I'm not a historian and I don't know why I keep doing that to myself.
You're like, I don't know why I keep writing historical fiction. It just happens to me.
Yeah, but it was just kind of like it was one of those like I know enough about racism and our the history of our country to know that nobody is going to write that history or those those historical accounts don't necessarily exist in paper form where I can find them. I've had to kind of cobble things together and there are some scholars and academics that I've spoken to that are doing the nonfiction version of this. But I flew up to Chico and like there was one guy who's supposedly a descendant of one of Sutter's Hawaiians who started giving these lectures and stuff. And so there were these student transcriptions of it. And that was the most I found. So I flew up to Chico and went into the little research library and saw the scrawl and tried to piece things together. So I hope I do that story justice, but it's kind of using fiction in a way that to connect dots that we might never be able to otherwise.
To
So
put names to faces and put them back in history,
yeah,
where they belong and where they've always been,
yeah. Well, and I'm hoping so next
and
year.
before it gets too far late, where like you said, it
Exactly.
disappears.
Well, and next year there's going to be a big, huge celebration next September to celebrate the anniversary of statehood for California. So I'm
Oh,
hoping that we can at least get something out around that time
that would be
to,
perfect.
to kind of just acknowledge like Hawaiians played a huge role in California and American history. They
Yeah,
were they were kind of a they helped because they
yeah.
considered themselves civilized. They didn't, they were like, sure, we'll help you civilize that wild nation. So that'll be a fun one to talk about, fun one to promote. I'm hoping like
So
gold rush days and
I'm
stuff.
guessing we can like look for updates on your social media to know more about like dates, timelines, like the
Yeah,
progress,
hopefully
what's coming.
it's with my editor now, so it's out of my hands, but we'll see. Hopefully sooner than not, I will make some kind of
No, I can't wait.
definitive announcements. Yeah.
I cannot wait. So we're gonna look for that one. And then before we sign off, can you just for the readers and viewers again, if they want to look more into some of the books that we talked about today besides Hula, the other one was Fire Exit.
Fire exit.
You could say the author again.
Morgan Talty.
Okay. And then you also talked about Shark Diaries.
Shark Dialogues by Kiana Davenport,
Dialogue.
which is an old one, but oldie but goodie. Some current ones that are one that is really, really, it's a collection of short stories that came out right around the time, a little bit after Hula, was Megan Kamale Kakimoto's Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare. I mean, she's a phenomenal young writer coming out of Hawaii. I think she has a novel coming out sometime soon-ish. But so a lot of good stuff coming out of Hawaii, and then also just indigenous literature in general, about blood quantum and everything else. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been an absolute delight and pleasure, and I cannot wait to read your next book. And thanks for talking about Hula today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jasmine.